For 17 years, I've been driving plows through the unforgiving winters of northern Maine. Storms this bad are rare, but this year's blizzard taught me something new. Desperation changes people. I run a night shift plow route through sparsely populated back roads, keeping the roads clear for morning traffic. Usually, it's just me, the engines growl, and static-filled radio chatter. Occasionally, I'd help pull someone out of a ditch or calm a frustrated homeowner. But on that Thursday night in February, the storm turned routine into chaos. The forecast called for 10 inches, manageable. But by midnight, nearly 24 inches had fallen, and it was still snowing sideways in gale-force winds. Most plow operators were sent home for safety, but I volunteered to stay on. My route is rural, and I knew people might still be out there, stranded and scared. Around 1:30 a.m., dispatch radioed in about a vehicle stuck near Ridge Creek Road, 15 miles out of town. A father and his teenage son were trying to get home after leaving a late shift at the paper mill. Their SUV was buried in a snowdrift and running low on fuel. It took me nearly an hour to crawl halfway there through whiteout conditions. My plow lights barely cut through the swirling snow. Then I noticed headlights far behind me. At first I assumed it was another plow, but as the lights grew closer, I realized it was a black SUV tailing me, far too close for safety. I let it slide. People often follow plows during storms, hoping for safer passage. But something about this one felt off. When I reached Ridge Creek, I spotted the stranded SUV, hazard lights flashing weakly in the snow. But they weren't alone. 3 other cars had stopped along the cleared stretch of road. Drivers stood outside in the biting wind, waving their arms. As I approached, I could see the chaos unfolding. A heated argument was underway. One man shouted about his diabetic wife at home needing insulin. Another yelled about his baby needing formula. A third, dressed in a thick camo jacket, argued his truck needed pulling first because he had a generator in the back that could help others. Voices overlapped, rising above the howling storm. The black SUV that had been following me pulled up beside the cluster, and 2 men stepped out. They didn't join the shouting. They just stood there, watching, as though sizing up the group. I radioed for backup, but the county was stretched thin. Help wouldn't come anytime soon. The scene was growing uglier by the second. A woman tried to calm everyone down, but her pleas were drowned out. When one man shoved another into the snowbank, I knew I had to intervene. I exited my truck, shouting over the wind to get their attention. "Everyone, back in your cars. We'll handle this one at a time." Most reluctantly listened. But as I helped the father and son into my plow to warm up, one of the men from the black SUV approached. He leaned close to my cab window, eyes sharp and hollow. "We've got emergencies too," he said. His tone was flat, not pleading like the others. I offered a curt response, telling him to wait his turn. Instead of arguing, he stepped back, blending into the storm. His partner stayed near the group, pacing between vehicles. Something about the way they moved made my gut tighten. Once the father and son were secure, I worked to clear a path. The wind screamed, and snow pelted my face as I moved between vehicles. In the corner of my eye, I noticed one of the black SUV men rummaging through a car trunk, not his own. I shouted at him, and he raised his hands defensively, retreating to his vehicle. It was then I realized what they were doing. These men weren't stranded. They were scavengers, preying on those too desperate or distracted to notice. I had no choice. I told the others to lock their doors and stay put until help arrived. When I climbed back into my plow, one of the scavengers stepped in front, blocking my way. He raised his hands as if to reason with me, but I didn't wait. I revved the engine and he stepped aside, his smirk burned into my mind. I escorted the father and son back to safety that night, but the stranded vehicles stayed until morning. I heard later that supplies were stolen from several cars, emergency kits, blankets, even gas siphoned from tanks. The black SUV was long gone. Since then, I've made a rule. I don't stop for groups. I'll help individuals, but I've learned the hard way that fear and desperation bring out the worst in people. Winter storms aren't just dangerous because of the ice and snow. They reveal what people are capable of when the world feels like it's closing in. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. Running an ice shack rental business in northern Wisconsin isn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I had 8 shacks on Lake Birchwood, catering to weekend hobbyists and tourists chasing the authentic winter experience. Most years, it was routine work. That was until Paul Grayson rented Shack 6. Paul wasn't like my usual customers. No rods, no auger, no enthusiasm for fishing at all. He showed up with a laptop, strange equipment he called tracking instruments, and rented Shack 6 for a month up front, cash only. He said he was studying underwater seismic activity for a university project. I should have checked his credentials. The first odd thing was his schedule. Ice fishermen come early, eager to catch sunrise bites. But Paul only worked nights. He'd arrive after sundown, stay until just before dawn, and kept to himself. Quiet guy, paid on time, and didn't bother anyone, so I left him alone. That is, until the complaints started. Fishermen in neighboring shacks began reporting strange noises. Low mechanical hums late at night. Not the usual sounds of ice groaning or creaking. When I checked the shack during the day, everything looked normal, but I began noticing strange holes around Shack 6. They weren't made by any auger I'd ever seen. Perfectly round, far wider than necessary for fishing, and with odd, almost claw-like markings at the edges. Then, last Tuesday, Paul called me at midnight, saying his heater had quit. Normally, I'd have told him to wait until morning, especially with the ice thinning from an unseasonable warm spell, but he insisted it was urgent. Against my better judgment, I headed out. When I arrived, the inside of Shack 6 wasn't what I expected. His tracking instruments weren't for seismic readings. They looked like heavy-duty sonar and deep water diving equipment. On the table was what I recognized as a scanning device. Paul barely acknowledged me, muttering something about signals and coordinates. When I pressed him, he admitted he wasn't studying the lake's geology. He was looking for something under the ice. As he spoke, I caught the faint glow of headlights across the lake. Snowmobiles. 3 of them heading straight for us. Paul saw them and froze. "They're early," he whispered. His voice cracked with panic. "The ice won't hold them." He frantically began gathering his equipment, but the combined weight was too much. The shack groaned under the strain, and then we heard it. The unmistakable sound of ice cracking. "Leave it!" I yelled, but Paul clung to a sealed, waterproof case like his life depended on it. The snowmobiles were nearly upon us when the ice gave way. Shack 6 shuddered, tilted, and part of the floor collapsed into the freezing water. Paul and his equipment tumbled in. I managed to grab him with my rescue pole, but the case he was clutching almost pulled us both under. The snowmobilers stopped short when they heard his screams, their headlights cutting across the broken ice. They watched us for a moment, then veered off into the night without a word. I got Paul out, but by then he was hypothermic and barely coherent. He kept muttering, "It's still down there," over and over. The authorities arrived hours later. They treated it as an accident at first until divers searched the lake bed beneath Shack 6. What they found wasn't seismic equipment or fishing gear. It was a sealed package, heavy, watertight, and illegal. From what little I overheard, it was part of a smuggling operation. Turns out Paul wasn't Paul. He was a low-level runner for some bigger players who had been using the lake as a drop site for years, hiding packages under the ice in winter and retrieving them in summer. The cops closed my business for weeks during the investigation. They found 3 more packages scattered across the lake. Paul disappeared after he recovered, skipping town as soon as he was discharged from the hospital. Shack 6, it's off limits now. Under maintenance is what I tell curious customers, but I can't shake the feeling that the lake isn't done with this story. Just last night I saw snowmobile lights circling where Shack 6 once stood. They lingered for a while before vanishing into the dark. This morning, I found an envelope pinned to my office door. No name, no return address, just a note with a phone number and an offer. More money than I'd make in 5 years. I tore it up, but I know they'll be back. They always come back. Now, I'm considering selling the business and moving inland. Some lakes are better left alone, their secrets undisturbed. Because if there's one thing I've learned, it's not the ice that's dangerous. It's the people trying to use it to hide what they don't want found. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. When I accepted the maintenance supervisor position at Ridgewood Mountain Lodge, it seemed like the perfect gig. Free housing in the staff quarters, good pay, and minimal work during the off-season, mostly just repairs and upkeep. What they didn't mention was why the job opened up every winter. At first, everything was smooth. September was busy with leaf peepers, October brought weekend hikers, and November had early ski season tourists. It wasn't until late December that things started to feel off. The first strange incident happened during a snowstorm. The lodge was nearly empty, but I got an alert about power usage in cabin 19. According to the guest registry, the cabin was unoccupied. With the storm raging, I had to check it out. Heating issues in the middle of winter are no joke. When I got there, the door was locked, no signs of a break-in. But inside I found wet boot prints leading from the back window. The room smelled faintly of bleach, and a few towels were missing from the bathroom. I reported it to the manager, Claire. She brushed it off, saying, "It happens sometimes. Locals sneak in during storms." She told me to change the locks and move on, but it didn't stop. Over the next few weeks, I'd find signs of someone staying in empty cabins, food wrappers, missing supplies, even a half-empty IV bag once. No one saw anything, and the security cameras never picked up movement. It was as if whoever was sneaking in knew exactly how to avoid being seen. Then came the January blizzard. The storm was forecasted to drop 4 feet of snow, with hurricane-force winds. We had a small group of stranded guests, mostly skiers who couldn't make it down the mountain. Around midnight, I got another power alert, this time from cabin 34, farthest from the main lodge. Claire was off-site, snowed in at her own place, so I grabbed my flashlight and headed out. The snow was coming down so hard I could barely see, and the wind stung like needles. As I approached cabin 34, I noticed fresh tracks leading to the door. Boot prints, big ones, still wet from melted snow. I knocked, but there was no response. Using my master key, I opened the door. Inside, the scene stopped me cold. The furniture had been pushed aside, and the room looked more like a makeshift operating theater than a cozy mountain cabin. There was a surgical table in the middle of the room, surrounded by IV stands, monitors, and equipment I didn't recognize. A metal case covered in frost sat against the wall. Before I could fully process what I was seeing, the door behind me creaked. I turned to find a man standing there, bundled in heavy winter gear, holding a black duffel bag. His face was pale and hard, his eyes sharp. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. What is this?" I stammered. He stepped closer, his voice low and calm. "Walk away. Forget what you saw." That's when I heard it, a rumble outside, cutting through the wind. I turned to the window and saw headlights piercing the storm. A snowcat was pulling up to the cabin. 3 figures climbed out, dragging a long object wrapped in a tarp. The man spoke again, his tone colder. "This is your last chance. Close the door. Go back to the lodge. This has nothing to do with you." I don't know if it was fear, instinct, or just plain survival kicking in, but I did what he said. I backed out of the room, shut the door, and stumbled into the snow, heading back to the lodge without looking back. I spent the rest of the night in the staff office, glued to the security feeds. Around 3 a.m., the snowcat disappeared into the blizzard, and by dawn, cabin 34 was spotless. No surgical table, no equipment, no tarp. Just an empty, pristine room. When Claire returned, I told her everything. She didn't even flinch. "It's been happening for years," she admitted. "Certain people rent the cabins during storms. They pay well, and the lodge turns a blind eye. Discreet procedures, high-paying clients. You'll get used to it." I didn't press her further, but the implications were clear. These weren't locals sneaking in to keep warm. Now I know better than to ask questions. If I get an alert from an empty cabin, I log it as a system error. If I hear boot prints in the snow outside, I ignore them. And if I see the snowcat's headlights cutting through the storm, I lock my office door and wait for morning. Winter's almost over, and soon the regular tourists will return. Things will feel normal again, for a while. But I know when the storms roll in next year, the same patterns will start. And I'll have to make the same choice, look away or become part of it. Some jobs come with secrets. And at Ridgewood Mountain Lodge, the biggest secret isn't the winter storms. It's what happens when no one is looking.